Hello, I'm Neil Knobloch,
Hi, I'm Wei Wei Wang.
and we're here today to share with you a module that focuses on assessing integrated STEM outcomes. This is the last module of the 6-series module that we have created, and we hope that this has been a benefit to your development as you transition to becoming a more integrated STEM teacher. You'll see that this module focuses on defining formative and summative assessment, identifies examples of formative and summative assessments, and also to be able to explain the process to develop an analytical rubric to assess STEM projects. So as we begin thinking about assessment of outcomes, we start with the end in mind. So what do you want to accomplish, or what do you want students to accomplish? This is done by identifying your learning objectives, which are more specific, or your learning outcomes, which really can be a little bit more general and is reflective of what happens if they complete a learning experience or a number of lessons, such as a unit or the end of a course. So let's go to learning objectives, and let's break this down a little bit. Learning objectives have two parts. They have an action verb, and they have a direct object. So I tried to share with you an example that is very straightforward. The action verb is to explain, and the direct object is photosynthesis. This is a two-word learning objective. And so you'll see that they're fairly straightforward and easy to write. Just be sure to use behavioral, measurable, objective action verbs to write your objectives so that they are clear to the students and you'll know if you can measure them. So that's the first step. Begin with the end in mind, the learning objectives. Then the second step is to think about what the evidence would look like to be able to know if they accomplished the learning objective. So this is done by looking at two types of evidence. As an educator, you'll likely be familiar with objective-based evidence, and these are typically multiple choice or maybe a guided short essay that are used to help students see that this is the correct answer. A performance-based assessment or evidence would be using a rubric, and it's typically done to assess a project. And we'll share more about what that looks like. But you can see that for the example, explain photosynthesis, we could use a objective-based evidence approach by asking students to explain and to write this out, and then you would be able to evaluate their narrative to see if that evidence was there to determine if they met the learning objective. Now the third step you think about is then what would you actually use for a form of assessment? And there's two types of assessments that you'll be learning about today. One is formative assessment and the other is summative. Formative is essentially what happens real time so that you can adapt and students can adapt in the learning process. Summative is a way to determine if they met the objective at the end of a day, lesson, unit, etc. And you'll see that there are a number of different assessment tools that can be used for formative as well as summative. For example, you could actually have students complete a quiz and you could use that for either formative or summative depending on what your purpose was. So now let's transition to the different types of learning outcomes. So zooming out a little bit from the learning objectives, you can see these can be cognitive, emotional, or behavioral in nature. And we've listed 6 different types that you can see. The first one is around understanding and remembering key concepts. So this would be content or cognitive. Another one is to know and use integrated STEM content. So again, this is likely to be on the cognitive side. Perhaps skill related, it could be behavioral. The third one is be able to relate to the integrated STEM content to other content areas. Again, a cognitive focused learning outcome. The fourth one is to understand the personal and social implications of knowing about the integrated STEM content. Well, this starts to zoom out a little bit more broadly and help students make connections to the real world. Still cognitive for the most part, but if there is personal connections that take place in their experiences, you might actually be tapping into the emotional development around that as well. Number 5 is caring about STEM content. Well, the idea of caring is clearly going to be driven by an emotional connection, that students feel this connection to the integrated STEM content. And then number 6 know how to keep on learning about the STEM content after a course is over is really a behavioral outcome, which is a lifelong learning outcome that you can help them develop. So it's really inspiring them to want to continue to learn beyond your experience with them. So let's take a look at behavioral action verbs, which lead to the type of evidence which leads to using an assessment tool. As we mentioned in an earlier slide, two parts to the behavioral learning objective is action verb and the direct object. You'll see that there are two examples listed here. Students will identify what plants need to grow, is example 1. Example 2, students will explain the difference between photosynthesis and respiration. So as we look through this approach, you can see that the first example listed in the table, in that first row, the behavioral action verb is to identify. You'll see that the type of evidence is that students could state the key word, make a list, match associated words, or correctly identify keywords from a short list of words. And so that's the type of evidence you would be looking for as the educator to see if students met that behavioral objective, and then what would you use to then gather the evidence. These are assessment tools. It could be a review game, short open-ended question, matching, or the use of multiple choice items. Now let's take a look at example number 2. The action verb is to explain. The evidence is that students would share an oral or written response to then demonstrate the knowledge. This could be done through an oral response or through a short essay. Hopefully this is a good example of, or a couple examples that show you how to use the alignment of your learning objectives, the types of evidence that will be generated as you then use assessment tools to gather the evidence. So now let's take a look at what are formative assessments. Formative assessments are those that are used to check for understanding so that both the educator as well as the learner can adjust to make progress in meeting those learning objectives or outcomes. I refer to these as real-time assessments. So things that you would actually monitor during the learning process to then be able to make adjustments either in that moment or maybe when the next time you would meet with the learners would take place. Examples, there's a lot of examples, hundreds of them in fact, but we list a few here. Activity worksheets, lab notes, observation checklists, questions that the instructor will ask, a review game or a feedback activity to, again, provide the information to see if the students are learning this information so that the educator can monitor understanding during the lesson. Some additional examples of formative assessments. And these are some you could look up. You could Google them and you'll see a variety of different examples. But here's one, a 3-2-1. What's 3-2-1? What are 3 things you liked about today's lesson? What are 2 things you learned? And what's one item that, or one question that's still unclear? A muddy point. Another one is the exit slip. So that would be before students leave the experience, or it could be the admit slip. Before they come into the experience, they could write a 1-minute essay. Using a note card, on one side of the card, they can write down one thing that they learned, or if it was an admit, it could be one thing they would like to learn. On the other side of the card, what's the muddiest point, or what wasn't unclear? That would be on the exit slip. And on the admit slip, it could be similar as what is something that's still not clear to you that you would like to spend more time on. Individual whiteboards could be used in a non-electric form of showing feedback to the educator, but an electronic form could be clickers, and of course the simple raise your hand if. All of these 3 methods are very similar, and it's simply giving all of the learners the opportunity to respond to a question, and of course the educator can then monitor to see how are people responding to the questions. And that works really well in a variety of different settings. Another one is an ungraded quiz. So this is useful if you want to introduce students to the type of quiz questions that you may be giving them someday. But you can say, let's just do ungraded. This is not going to count for any correct answers. Let's just do this and see how this goes. And so then you can go through the answers, you can talk about why the answers were correct or not correct, and that can give students feedback, and also to the educator to know how students are responding and why they might be responding the way they are. Some fun games that are done now using online platforms are Kahoot. Another one is Mentimeter. And so you can look these up, and you could actually turn it into like a quiz bowl type of an experience for students. And those are always a lot of fun. You just have to have the technology available to use them. And then you have a cooperative learning strategy called Think, Pair, Share, or Pass a Question. And those are a couple fun ways of getting students to talk socially about the academic content that you wanted them to learn for the day. So just a few examples to keep in mind as you think about developing your unit or your STEM lessons and how to get feedback in real time. So now let's transition to summative assessment. Summative assessment is checking for understanding to determine if a level of performance or an objective or outcome has been achieved. So this is really to determine a grade or to determine the percent of accuracy that students were able to demonstrate in completing whatever the assessment or the assignment was. There are a variety of different examples as well, and many would be familiar with the typical quizzes, knowledge test. You could also use questionnaires to test motivation, to measure motivation. You know, how interested were you in this project? You could also use project grading checklist that Dr. Wong will talk about here in a few slides, or analytic rubrics that she'll share with you as well. You can do that to evaluate knowledge as well as skills and social and emotional outcomes. So the rubrics on the grading checklist can be a little broader in including skills or behaviors as well as the social and emotional outcomes. And then we have another point we'd like to make here, that summative assessments are not done real time, but they're done at the end of or completion of an assignment, project, or unit of instruction. And so again, this is typically for grading purposes. If it's an after-school program or if it's a non-formal program, you can still use these as a way to try to help students see and the educators see to what extent were they able to accomplish what was expected of them. And grades don't have to be assigned, but there's still this expectation of a level of performance is being determined. So some examples of summative assessments for the object-based category, the typical knowledge test, true, false, multiple choice, etc. And then another one which involves some writing, where the students need to do some writing, is what's called a guided short essay. So I'll show you an example of one of those here in the next slide. And then for performance-based, these are assessments that are used for projects typically, or assignments. And Dr. Wong will share these two examples with you. But one is called a rating scale or a checklist, and the other one is a rubric. And these are very useful for evaluating assignments and projects that typically are a little bit more complex. And you need to then determine, okay, what evidence is there based upon what was expected. So now let's go through these. The first category is the objective-based test. These are typically used in formal or school-based education settings, but they can be used in informal and non-formal education settings to assess learning outcomes and then report program impact. A number of grants had the expectation that there was an evaluation conducted, and so they can also be useful for even those informal, non-formal education settings. And you can build them in so they don't feel like it's a test or a quiz, but it's part of the learning process. They're typically used to assess learning objectives or outcomes such as knowledge and motivation. And as we mentioned previously, these are typical, very typical in education as quizzes or exams. And also questionnaires can be used to assess perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, and motivations. So something useful to keep in mind as you maybe think about the social emotion categories or outcomes that you're after. An example of an objective-based test, keeping plants as the theme, you can see the knowledge item on the left-hand side. The example is which part of the plant takes in water, and there are 5 different choices there. Again, keeping these simple and easy to read with viable options or distractors is what's important. And then the second example that we have is an interest item. So this is from an instrument that we've used in conducting research with STEM education. And so here it is. I was interested in the STEM activity, and then the students would have the choice 1 through 5. Not at all, a little, somewhat, quite a bit, and absolutely are the 5 choices they could choose. And there would be a number of interest items that you could then create a mean and standard deviation for. Now let's take a look at another type of an objective-based evidence, and this assessment tool is called the guided short essay. So the steps as you would take as an educator would be to provide a context, and the example on the right-hand side is listed there as a gardener. You've been asked to plant a garden in a 10 by 10 foot area in a community garden next to your apartment. The second thing you do is to share a prompt. So this is the question. What are 3 specific sources you will study and or get information from to try to learn how to plan a garden to raise vegetables? And then you'll see the third thing you'll do is to state the number of possible points. So you mentioned that you want to know about 3 specific sources, so therefore in this case we said, well, let's just give 1 point per source. This is worth 3 points. Now you could make it worth more than that if you felt that that maybe some of the sources were more important than others. And then you could, for the last point here, for grading, you would then need to list the possible correct answers, and then those are listed as bulleted items there: extension publications, websites, catalogs, people's books, and magazines. And so this is what you would call the essay, but we call it the guided short essay because you can see it's very specific. You're looking for maybe 3 specific things, and you actually are indicating how many points this is worth.
All right, so rating scales, grading checklist, and the rubric are the summative assessment examples. They are performance-based type of a summative assessment. How rating scales and rubric are similar and different? Both rating scale and rubric has a wish list of what you want students to be able to know and do with the assignment. Typically, this wish list aligns with the learning objectives, and those criteria reflect on students will need to perform. How the rating scales and rubric different? In the rating scale, each criterion is assigned some point, and the assigned points are based on the importance, critical thinking, and difficulty of the task. On the other hand, instead of assigning points to each criterion, rubric has assigned points in each level. In each level, an educator could provide more details to criterion, which is sub-criteria, to evaluate students' work. Unlike rating scale only provide a description of excellence performance. Because more description are provided in the rubrics to describe criterions in each level, educator could easily weight criteria differently. Just keep in mind, rating scale is a good start for you to develop a more complicated rubric. So here are some advantages of using rating scales. It's a good place to start if you do not have time to develop a rubric. They can identify the criteria very easy. Define the excellence of performance. These are the total possible points for each criteria. Some students find rating scales are easy to follow. For the number 6 points, rating scale provide a more arbitrary rating systems than the rubric. So this can be considered as a disadvantage of using the rating scales. So here are some examples of rating scales. As you can see, each one's being spelled out describes the excellence performance of the task. And you can assign the points to each of the items in here. Now we're gonna move on to the rubrics. So we have mentioned the point assignments can be arbitrary in the previous slide. Now you can see why. In a grading scale, educator can provide, in a grading rubric, educator can provide more detail to assign points to each level. Instead of using arbitrary or based on my mood, ways of grading, a rubric is a better way to standardize your summative assessments. So here you can see there are points assigned to each level, and then each level you can provide more details in the rubric. So this is another examples of for the rubric that you can see. So let's take a look. So the criteria described why forest management was important and why it is important to base management plans of multiple species. So let's take a look at the multiple species in here. So in the poor performance, students did not mention single species management. And in a good performance here, they only mention single species management, and for the excellence, that the student discuss, not only mention, but discuss the problem with the single species management. So you will be able to choose from 0 to 8 points as a pool, and good will be 9 to 14 points, and excellence for 15 to 20 points. So those are the criteria that you will be able to use, and as you can see, more details in the rubric. So now, I will give the stage back to Dr. Nabla and then make the closing mark here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wong. We'll close things up today by looking at the reflection questions that we'd like you to think about. The first one, how do you make sure your assessments are aligned with the learning objectives? Number 2, how do you choose or develop questions to help your students learn? Number 3, what are examples of formative assessments you use to provide feedback to your students? Number 4, what are examples of summative assessments that you use in your classes? And number 5, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using checklists compared to rubrics? We'd also like you to work on some things that can help you to apply the knowledge and skills we shared with you in this module. As you plan for the integrated STEM learning in your class, write down some ways that you'll adapt student assessments to measure A, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary learning, B, system thinking, and C, database decision making. And we'd also like you to brainstorm what criteria and evidence will be used in your integrated STEM project rubric. So as you ask students to work on an assignment or a project, what would that rubric start to look like? What criteria would you have, and what evidence would then they need to demonstrate to show that they met that criteria? So thank you for being a part of this learning experience with Module 6 as well as all of the modules. And we'd just like to close by acknowledging Brianna Nelson, our graduate assistant, who helped organize and develop the slides for this module. Also, a couple sources of funding that support this project. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Dr. Wong or myself, and we'd be glad to assist you.